Hello, everyone. Welcome to the afternoon session. My name is Andrew Breen. I'm Vice President of Product Delivery at American Express. Here to talk about living lean in a large organization, one that's particularly highly regulated as we are at American Express. Let me just first introduce myself quickly. I've been in the tech industry for about 20 years, done 8 startups, so I've been actually quite a bit on that side of the equation. Had a few dalliances with larger enterprises, spent about 5 years at Palm, where I was responsible for and learned a lot of lessons relevant to this experience to try to basically take a process that was based on building hardware, which still to this day is basically kind of 18-month cycles if you look at device manufacturers, and try to innovate in rapid cycles to build software in that environment. So it taught me a lot of lessons about how to kind of break down an organization that was kind of set in its ways. I also teach at NYU's Stern School of Business on tech product management, where we kind of use lean as a kind of basis for teaching MBA students how to basically operate in a startup type organization. Oops, wrong page. So first I just want to actually check in the room kind of how people's organizations work. So just as a show of hands, how many people are currently in their organization using lean to basically implement or try to do something lean within their organization? How many people are aspiring to do lean? Okay. Anyone here from, I assume most people are probably from large enterprise, anyone here from smaller growth stage companies? Okay, very good. Just helps understand that. So we'll talk about how it feels to be kind of an innovator. Sometimes people use the word entrepreneur. It's a weird term, hard to pronounce, inside a larger organization. I harken back to 20 years ago, the movie Speed, if you guys remember, right? To recall, there's this bus barreling down the highway. If they go below 50 miles an hour, there's a bomb goes off and terrible things happen. Well, sometimes inside a large organization, you feel like this thing's barreling down a path, and only if our heroes, within it, can basically steer it in the right direction and save us. That's sometimes how it feels to be, an entrepreneur, an innovator inside some of those large organizations and the challenges that you face them. One of the things I wanted to talk about was being responsive. Has anyone heard of responsive organizations, responsive companies? Are we familiar with that term? Okay, good. So I'll talk to you about it today. It's actually a term, I certainly can't take credit for it. If you go to responsive.org, there's an interesting kind of manifesto about it. It was really kind of pioneered by some folks in New York City that actually were involved in helping set up our program at American Express, a company formerly called Undercurrent, their consultancy. They're now called August, and they do some really interesting work here. But let me just quickly define what it means to be a responsive organization. First, they're built through learning and responding rapidly with open flow of information. They encourage experimentation, and they learn in very rapid cycles. They're a network of employees as opposed to kind of hierarchies, customers and partners, all kind of working together on a shared purpose. So, does that sound like your organization? Well, it didn't sound like Amex. And to some degree, we're getting better, but we're not all the way there today. But a lot of people, kind of resonate with more command and control structures, right? If you're in a large organization that's fairly traditionally structured, you're probably fairly used to kind of command and control, the sense of that, commands come down, status reports go up, and that's generally how the organization operates, right? And that was generally fine for the better part of the 20th century, right, where we had very predictable environments, right? Year after year, day after day, product after product, things went according to a fairly predictable script, and you kind of operated that way. But in this era, the digital era, what's really happened in the last 15 years is that everything is less predictable and controllable. Why is that? Well, consumers, first of all, are quite empowered now, right? Before, it was go, do some product development, and then take your marketing might and scream from the highest hill with all your dollars, and people will believe your product is the best and move along onto the next product, right? We don't have that luxury anymore. We have Amazon reviews, Yelp, social media, things like that, right? So consumers are empowered, and there's this kind of democratization of information that freely flows around and flows very, very quickly. So even if you attempt to control it, you're probably doomed to a great failure there, right? So the only constant, the only thing we can rely on here is that there's change, right? And the problem is that most 20th century style organizations are not set up to basically adapt and to deal with this in any real way. So that's the old conventional management thinking. responsive organizations thrive in these environments. So not only do they deal with it, but they actually thrive in it. They actually use it as a competitive advantage. Well, why is that? So let's look at kind of both sides of the equation here and how a 20th century versus a 21st century and responsive company basically deals with these things, right? So one really important thing is that they all still have a sense of purpose, right? So, if you're in a smaller entity, a startup, right, one of the things that, people have typically in a startup is this real sense of purpose, right? Startups are hard. You really need to be kind of, joined at the hip with your team and knowing what you're doing, right? They tend to organize around, kind of networks of things, not really hierarchies, as I mentioned earlier. There's this real dynamic. Even if you look at large tech companies, Googles and the Facebooks, right? They don't have big hierarchies. They have quite flat organizations. They empower their people because they basically perform at these networks that are highly dynamic, right? The people can, have a lot of decision making, have a lot of information, have a lot of transparency, so that they can self-organize to better adapt to the situations, as opposed to requiring it to flow up in the organization, all of that analysis to happen, and then decision-making to flow back down, right? So it's a very, very different kind of mindset and approach. And then experimentation is fundamentally built into the organization, right? It's not another case of, let's do months and months of planning and analysis and research. It's actually, there's an idea we want to pursue, we think that's interesting, let's go test it out, let's go try it out, right? Probably a lot of the reasons that you guys are here at this conference. So those things are really quite, important and quite meaningfully different for companies that are kind of responsive and into this 21st century mindset, right? So Walter Isaacson got well known writing the Steve Jobs biography recently. He has a new book coming out about Bell Labs. And one of the interesting things that he observed there was that sustainable innovation is not, based on what's going on in garages, what's been lionized kind of in the Silicon Valley in this area. It's not really where sustainable innovation happens. It happens when you bring diverse people, diverse talents, diverse mindsets together, putting them physically together, and then letting that serendipitous stuff happen, spontaneously, right? People sitting together on top of each other, where they form bonds, form relationships, exchange ideas formally and informally, right? That's where sustainable innovation happens, right? So that's a really important kind of, I think, understanding and insight that is a way we need to restructure kind of our large corporations, where I'm sure you all deal with people that are far-flung locations, different areas, right? You're constantly on the phone in meetings, things like that. You're not necessarily sitting on top of the people that you're working with on a day-to-day basis, and that's a disadvantage. So I like to say process begets innovation. You can go out, you can hire someone who's an innovator to come into your company. You can hire agencies, consultants that could come in and do that. But that's basically a hits business. That's looking for the next great 70s soul singer, right? You want something that is sustainable, that you can repeat, right? And a process, which large companies are quite good at, is a way to do that. And Lean actually is great because it gives us that framework, right? The great thing, and I was talking to Eric the other night, and I said, the great thing was, I was kind of doing this stuff for a while, for the better part of 20 years, but you guys kind of codified it, right? You kind of put it down on paper in a really simple, nice framework that it could easily communicate out to people. Before, product management, product development was this like really dark art. And we never could really understand, why did this one work and this one didn't? Like, whatever, agile and all these other kind of things. But now we have Lean as a really nice, elegant framework to basically, tell us that. So let me get a little bit more into what we're doing at Amex to kind of get to that, is kind of setting that as the stage for what we're doing here. So one of the things I should say about the payments industry in general is that because of primarily regulation and capital requirements, we've been fairly well insulated from being disrupted by startups, right? There have been a few out there, Square probably the most prominent one there, but I think they kind of realized, and they've now kind of pivoted out of the mainline payments business to be much more about merchant servicing. They kind of realized that the amount of scale they had to get to be profitable in this business was just enormous, right? So it's very, very challenging to basically get yourself to that level. So the thing, though, that we are threatened by, and not in a direct way, but more of an orthogonal way, are the scale tech players, the Apples, the Googles, the Amazons, the Alibabas, people like that, where they're not going to necessarily create a parallel product or payment network against us, but they are basically putting themselves in between the customer and transaction relationship, right? And so that's very important. You look at something like Apple Pay, which was very informative. In the short term, that was very friendly to the payments network, right? Great, looks like someone's maybe finally cracked the digital wallet nut here. We now can actually start seeing more transaction volume, that's good. But in the long term, certainly for American Express, who differentiates ourselves around servicing and our customer relationships, that's a threat. And so that's the stuff that basically drove them to say, we need to do something about that. We need to be operating more like an innovator at the scale that these companies are doing there. They've also redefined service, right? And again, I talk about servicing and things like, I press a button and I get a car from Uber. I press a button and I get a meal from Seamless, right? That's service, right, in our definition of what servicing is. And so they have redefined that, obviously primarily because of digital and the shift to digital. And so that is now also a threat because customer expectations have dramatically changed from just issue plastic, take phone calls, right? It's no longer that. It's this integrated digital experience. So what Amex decided, with the help of some of the consultants that I mentioned earlier, was they found me and pulled me out of startup land and basically said, let's go build a lean startup inside the company. And they decided to do it with the squad model, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second here. But they said, instead of doing it in like a lab, an innovation lab, like a lot of larger companies have been trying, we're going to put you right in the belly of the beast, right? We're going to put you right in the middle of the World Service Division, which is basically the division that's responsible for kind of the customer care, customer experience once we bring a customer, into the franchise. So that was a very kind of risky and at this point, I think, prescient decision. They said, I know this is going to be painful. I know this is going to be difficult, but let's do it this way because I know then the things that you come up with will be able to put into the machine. And I've talked to a lot of other folks and even talked to companies about their innovation labs and things like that. And the number one thing I hear over and over again is that they're doing really interesting, great things, but they cannot suck that back into the mothership, right? They cannot pull that innovation back in simply because the impedance that you're operating on in the lab versus what the big mothership is doing are just so out of sync. The lab is 2, 3, 5 years ahead. There's no way the operations can absorb that thing into it. And so what we did, and the advantage that I have, even though there's a lot of pain with it, is that I'm sitting right with those operational people. They know what I'm doing. I know what they're doing. We work off the same goals, right? We have the same objectives. I'm not able to get 2, 3, 4 years ahead of them because we sit under the same management and leadership going for the same goals. I might be 6 months or a year ahead of them. So it's been a real advantage, and I think opened my eyes to something that's fairly important as far as how large enterprises approach this. So let me just talk a little bit about the baseline that I came into. So American Express gave me a certain advantage to implement Lean. American Express has a real rigor around providing excellent, award-winning, leading customer service, customer care. It's something that we pride ourselves on. And it's more than just words. You can't just say that. You actually have to, walk the walk and do those kind of things. So we have something internally that we call RTF, or Refer to Friend, quite similar to Net Promoter Score, NPS, if you're familiar with that, where after servicing interactions, we basically communicate with our card members and we say, based on that servicing interaction, would you refer us to a friend, right? So based on a 10-point scale, and then where do you basically lie on that? And that is religion within our division. And not only do we actually look at that and see how we're doing overall, we rate groups on it, we rate teams on it, we rate individuals on it. People's compensation, in some cases, are actually based on this, right? So I actually came into an organization that had a deep respect for interacting with customers and understanding their needs and understanding what things worked and didn't work for them. But there was a problem. While we would find hotspots and find things where we could go and there's real customer dissatisfaction about product X, it wasn't getting into the regular cycle, particularly into the regular cycle of digital products, so that we had somewhere where we were taking this read from the market. And again, we measure it every day. I can look at it at any point in time, slice and dice it 8 ways from Sunday, and then put that back into the product experience, right? And as many of you know, Lean and other methodologies out there, and what we're trying to be today as good digital product managers is being data-driven. But data alone doesn't tell the full story. You have to complement that with the qualitative side as well. Data tells you where the problems are. The discussions with your customers find you the insights that you need to basically drive that forward, right? And so if you just look at the data, we're only getting part of the story. So one of the things I've noticed over time, and true at Amex and some other large enterprises I've been in and around, is that it tends toward, the currency of large enterprises tends to be toward ideas. Ideas are what people trade in internally within enterprises. Why is that? That was really kind of a strange thing to me. Well, it's really, really hard to execute inside of these big enterprises, right? You have to get alignment, you have to bring people on board, you have to get approval 6 ways from Sundays. It's very, very difficult to execute. So what people start optimizing toward is trading in ideas. Hey, I got this great idea. Like, look at what idea over here, right? I can't really actually go and execute against that, so at least let me, socialize the ideas. I came into an organization that was just flooded with ideas, and it was actually really good. I was quite happy about that. whenever I go into an opportunity and people say, hey, you're the idea guy, we want you to be, generating ideas. Like, whoa, you got a big problem then. You're coming to me for the ideas, that's not a situation I want to be in, right? The ideas are not in the room, they're out with the customers. Go talk to your customers, right? So we had no shortage of ideas, but it was a big challenge to actually execute on those ideas. There was also a big issue in our business, and certainly areas like healthcare, other highly regulated areas, there's a huge regression risk. If we did something to hurt our product, take away from the customer experience, there's a massive challenge. We're dealing with sensitive financial data, right? We cannot basically go willy-nilly out there and do something. And so what that leads to is, because there's so much risk, that you might actually go and do a lot of analysis, a lot of testing, things like that, which generally slow down the process. And finally, as in many large organizations, silos organizations make execution very, very difficult, where either you have big gaps of, hey, whose responsibility is that? Or huge amounts of overlap, because 2 or 3 teams or groups want to do it, make for a lot of alignment challenges and things of that nature. So those were some of the immediate challenges that we found and we had. So when we brought the lean mentality in, we did a couple things, and one of the things I tried to do first was understanding the culture and the values of the organization, so I could actually align the lean principles and values with the organizational values. And in many cases I was successful, in some cases it was not, and we'll talk about a few of those. But a lot of it was around execution efficiency. So my currency became execution. I was the guy, I was the team that could get things built because I had a process to do it and a methodology to do it with based on the lean framework. And I showed to them that lean was a de-risking the process. Everything from how we invested in projects and did things, basically the model was, hey, if you got a great idea, go put together a PowerPoint and a spreadsheet and run to an executive and see if you can get some sponsorship to basically go and do your project, right? That's a really high risk type of way to approach it. So I actually said, we're gonna work on very short cycles and we're gonna make the customers involved from the very, very beginning so I can help validate. And we're gonna be hypothesis driven, and if something doesn't work, we're gonna be more than happy that we learn from it and move on to the next thing, right? So it aligned with something saying, that's actually a much more conservative approach than your kind of investment process and investment approach there. So really quickly, I'm sure a lot of you know, and a lot of you work in larger companies, I won't dwell on this too long, but the story of IT, right? How did we kind of get here? There's been pendulum swings over the last 20 years between insourcing and outsourcing, and it goes back and forth, right? But because of that, it's kind of had this very consultative, type of approach where you're partnering with your business client and, doing those kind of things. And we kind of recognize now in the tech world that this is really not the way great products get done, right? There's a lot of challenges with that, and you get to this kind of throw it over the wall mentality, project orientation, right? But Agile is quite in fashion in large corporations, right? And about 5 years ago, American Express made a big commitment to Agile and Scrum, and we're going there, we're doing that, we're bringing a lot of engineers in-house, we're gonna put Scrum teams together and do all the kind of things that you do there. But you have to be careful if, are they doing it or are they faking it, right? I remember very early on, I was on a call with a Scrum master inside of one of our organizations, and she said to me, please send over the requirements, user stories, right? So you see a lot of word swapping, and that does not mean an Agile mentality, right? So what you have to do is basically ensure that people are adopting that, not just same people, different titles, different nomenclature. Are you actually adopting the culture and the mentality of that? But again, Agile only talks about the product development process. Lean provides the framework around doing the product development process. And so the other big thing that we had to break down was the project orientation. Everyone in the organization was project oriented. We had to change them to be product oriented. And it's a subtle but very important difference, right? Because project orientation is basically about getting from point A to point B. Not a lot of consideration usually around the user experience, not a lot of user involvement during that process, not a lot of feedback, and it basically get to the endpoint, get to the goal, and you're good, right? So it was launch it and leave it, move on to the next project. So we have a term we use called launch it and love it, right? Which is basically changing the mentality that, sure, launching something is an important milestone on the journey, but give each other high fives, go have a beer, but the next day is probably your most important day because now you're actually getting data and feedback from your users. So change that mentality. So something I say is projects are about output, products are about outcomes. So how can lean change some things for us? How did it change the framework? So this is actually something I use in my class, and I'm a bit of a wine geek, so anyone who's gone through sommelier training or knows that, knows the balance triangle, where in wine world you're trying to balance acidity, alcohol, and sweetness, right? And so the perfect wine is balanced right in the middle. Well, the perfect product is balanced in the middle between your users, your business goals, and your constraints or capabilities of what you can actually execute, right? So one of the things that I've done is I basically, being a good lean practitioner, I basically right up front define my KPI. And every product that we have, and all of my product managers do this, what are the KPI? What's the hypothesis, and how are we going to measure whether that hypothesis is successful, or, affirmed or refuted, right? But we align that with the company goals. Right? If you're inside any company, certainly a public company, you have goals, you have quantified goals that are the macro goals of the company or for your business unit, right? Make sure that they are aligned. Now, you can do something that is not aligned, but you have a much bigger bar to climb there, a much bigger hill to climb there, because that means you're trying to basically change the company strategy, right? You can do that, and sometimes a company needs that. But just understand, try to find that alignment so that you can talk in the language of people who are measuring this, right? From your finance office, from your project offices, your leadership. It's really, really important. But never forget, there's too many big companies on that triangle drift toward this direction to the business goals and forget about their users. Always reconcile back to your users. Is this good for our users? Will they see value in this? And talk to them to find out. The last, kind of part on the triangle is constraints and capabilities. What you can do, what you can build within your technical frameworks, your legal frameworks, other things like that, right? And what I found, and it certainly was true at Amex, is that what you can do starts becoming what you should do, and that's a very dangerous place to be, right? It's like, hey, we've got this technology vendor in-house, this piece of technology, hardware, software, consultancy, and they say we should do X. So let's just go do X, because I know trying to bring in a new vendor is going to be a total nightmare and pain in doing that. It's a very dangerous place to do. You should be very aware of your capabilities because they might shortcut you to get there, but do not let that be the guide and what dictates things for you. I imagine a lot of you being, good lean practitioners being at this conference are familiar with some diagram like this. Terminology might swap out, but don't assume people in your organization know this, right? I have this actually drawn on a whiteboard right near my area, and so everyone walks over to see us, runs into this, because I just constantly remind them, this is a cycle, and every so often we kick stuff out of the cycle because it fails upon test and measurement, right? So it's very important to, again, socialize this and to reinforce with people that you're talking to. So what's an MVP? That's an interesting definition, and we have a lot of debates internally. I know a lot of people always have different debates about what an MVP is. My definition, just so you can understand kind of the next couple of things that I'll talk about here, is an MVP is the minimal set of features you need to test a hypothesis. It's not the minimal set of features you need in a product to call it a product. It's the minimal set of things you need to test a hypothesis. And that's a very important aspect here, and something that people often gloss over as to what's too many, what's too few. I have quote-unquote MVPs that might be called fairly feature-rich because there's a hypothesis that I'm testing to try to get there. So how do I actually go and test this? Well, we use 3 distinct iterative cycles within the organization. When I'm in startup land, I'm doing clickable prototype, paper prototype, clickable prototype, alpha, beta, testing, getting feedback all through that process, just keep releasing, right? Well, that's not a reality inside of a large organization, certainly a heavily regulated organization. So we broke it into 3 distinct phases that we work through. So first we have prototype. That's playing in the sandbox. Fake data, nothing released. We invite users in, 10 to 50 users at various times, and we basically do depth interviews with them, right? It's purely qualitative, it's finding direction, it's finding and understanding their need, and if some of the concepts that we have satisfy their need, right? That's very important. I think people actually forget that when they talk about, even Lean doesn't talk enough about this, right? You have to know when you're talking to your users and you're assessing something, are you finding their need, or are you finding the solution for their need, right? And that gets you around the problems of a solution looking for a problem, but it also gets you to where you don't have a situation that you're basically going out and constantly looking for the hard problem and never basically addressing that, right? We all agree world hunger is a problem and a need that needs to be solved. No one's really figured out how to solve that at this point, right? So it's very important there. Next, we move into proof of concept. So Amex, when I came in, was pretty good at the left-hand side and pretty good at the right-hand side. They understood those processes, right? You want to play in the sandbox and not do anything real with users, that's fine. You want to go to production? Sure, we know how to do that. That's a big deal. But the one in the middle is the really problem one, and this is the most important one for us to test with. This is when we go from qualitative into quantitative, right? We actually say, because users, when you talk to them and interview them, oh, do you think you would use this? Oh, yeah, I definitely use this. This is great, right? So but what people say, what people do are quite different things. So we need to actually put it out and give it to them for a while with their real data in their real environment, but controlled, so that we can actually measure quantifiably if people are actually engaging with the product and using the product. So that's something that we brought in as being a key part of our process. And then finally, obviously, we scale to production beyond that. And we do this in 90-day cycles, right? When I was in startups, I'd say no more than a month to go through one of these cycles, in many cases down to weeks or days. And the reality of our organization, 90-day cycles, meets with an impedance that can work. Now, here's the interesting thing. There are probably ways and times I can really accelerate that to be quicker. You could talk about that. You hear people here that'll talk about, do it as fast as you possibly can. I'm not sure that's always the right mentality within a large organization, because you could oscillate actually too quickly for the organization, too quickly for people to process data, too quickly for people to understand the results of the test, too quickly for that decision making to come about. So I actually find that this for Amex is actually quite a good pace. Generally our projects were 9 months to 12 months, so bringing it down to a quarter was kind of a nice way to do that. Plus we give chances for people to work on something within a time frame and do some meaty work, but then basically move on to the other phases or move around to different projects. So it's good for the morale of the team, I find, as well, to show results and have some diversity. So how do we actually validate products when we can't just go throw some clickable prototype up on a website and invite 1,000 users in, right? That's the great thing in Breen, we love to do that, but that's not the reality in our world, certainly. So one of the things we had to do is we had to bring our legal and compliance on board and along for the journey. So just so you know, the process I walked into was, first of all, whether you're doing something where you're testing with one user or doing it for 40 million, you run through the same risk governance process. No difference, right? Whether I'm issuing a new credit card that's going to be a boom and major kind of launch, or I'm testing a minor feature add-on with a few users in person, same process. Big problem, right? The second part of this was that the way it worked was you developed your full product, get it ready for launch, and then you start the risk governance process, which, oh, by the way, the shortest of the risk governance process was 12 weeks. So imagine that you actually go through the cycle, whatever methodology you're using, and then they say, oh, by the way, take another quarter just to go through the risk governance process. A real limiter and obviously difficulty. So what we did was we asked our legal teams to basically work in parallel with us. So start doing your reviews off wireframes, off clickable, off feedback from users. Work with us in the process so that you're quite familiar, and we have your feedback, just like we're getting user feedback during the process. And we've gotten most of them to come along on that journey. However, that still is difficult. That still is a lot of extra work for us to do. So the two things which I'm very hopeful and very close to doing is getting carve-outs for testing. So carve out of that risk governance process to say, if you want to do employee tests, you can do it up to this amount, and this is how you do it. And if you want to do user tests, you can do it up to this amount for this time frame with these controls in place, sign waivers, things like that, and then you can do it as well without going through this bigger risk process. Now, just one note on employee testing, because when I came, one of the responses when I complained about this process was, well, just do employee testing, that's fine, right? We're all card members. That's pretty good. Dog fooding, as it's often called in the tech industry, right? There's a big word of caution with dog fooding, because a lot of people treat this as religion. If you're doing bug testing, you're doing usability testing, you're doing scale testing, things like that, doing it with employees is perfectly fine, right? But if you're trying to get user validation, employee testing is not the right way to go. You're too biased, with employees. It's something that will give you a lot of false markers, and so I really, hasten against doing that type of thing. So I often make this statement, I get a lot of confused looks or anguish from people. But it's something I really do believe. A little bit of wordplay on my part, but it's something that I put out there as trying to be something fairly strong. So within large companies, there's a lot of requests for status. What's the current status? What's the future status? What's the roadmap? Right? You hear this quite often. Well, I said, roadmaps, at least defined in the conventional sense, where you're basically placing things on some sort of time-based chart, Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, what we're doing across that, is something that's very, very much against lean. That basically starts binding you to this rigid system of expectations around delivery, right? You're in a large organization. This gets socialized. The marketing department starts teeing up their plans. The legal department starts planning for that. The CFO's office starts planning around what they're going to see as far as revenue from that. Very dangerous, because as we're doing iterations and we get feedback, we might have to completely pivot out of that, right? So that basically puts us in a difficult position to where either we say, well, we're not really doing lean, we got that feedback, but we got to stay in the roadmap. Or, oh, by the way, that roadmap, as soon as I printed it to you, it's basically worthless because I had to diverge into some kind of pivot. So what we do is basically we lay out a vision A vision is basically is a 3, 5, or 7-year plan that you can't easily get to. You can't draw a path to it right now, but it's where you want to go. One of the criticisms of lean and these iterative processes, they get so down in the weeds, they don't know where they're headed. They're kind of fishing around like that. But if you have a vision, it allows you to basically set a direction that everyone's on the same page with, and you can basically move around on your way to get there because it's far enough out. Define what your user need and your KPI. So very good upfront, we set up what our hypothesis is. What's our current iteration? We make that available for everyone to go in and test and see what's going on. What's the results of our last user test? How did that impact us? What are the learnings from that? What's our next iteration goal? What's the time frame around doing that? And then we do something that I call the work stream plan, or the backlog. And this is my replacement for a product roadmap. And this is actually one of my real ones, which I changed all the names to protect the innocent and not get in trouble with my compliance. And you can see, though, a very notable difference. This might look fairly familiar, but then there's a couple notable differences on here. One is look across the top. There's no Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4 up there, right? So what I've done is I say, now, I know what I'm doing right now. I'm fairly confident around that. I know what I'm doing next. Pretty confident around that. But here's some other things in the future, right? And we break it down by each work stream. And what people then can imply, because when you ask them what you're kind of looking for in a roadmap is, I really want to know the prioritization. I really want to know what's coming next. Well, this gives you a chance to see that, so that if I end up killing something, then you can see the next thing I'm going to move on to, right? So this is something that's actually worked very effectively, and I've started to get rid of the, where's the roadmap question, or at least people being satisfied with this type of tool. So another big thing is the funding model, right? So one of the big impediments, and again, project orientation within these organizations, is you're funded by projects, right? So, hey, 2016 planning, you've probably gone through it or going through it right now. What are you doing in Q3? How much money do you need for that? What are you going to deliver when, right? Really not something that lines up very well with experimentation, test, and learn. So one of the things we did is that work stream framework I just showed you, we basically have said, we're moving to funding work streams. You're not funding projects anymore. You're funding work streams. Let your product owners iterate and prioritize based on what they want to do. And as we learn and we go through quarterly kind of reviews of how we're progressing, then we see, do we pivot out of this and reallocate the funding to some other work stream? Or are things going quite well? Do we want to put more money into the work stream? And again, noting the mythical man month that hopefully you guys are familiar with, doubling the funding does not mean doubling the output, but again, it symbolizes what you're trying to do and that you can do more things with your teams to get more out of it. So let's talk about the company structure and how we've structured things or how we've worked within the structure. So any of these organizations doing complex technology products have some form of a matrix. Typically, it's led by your functional thing, right? Here's the design team, the engineering team, the marketing team. I actually learned a lot about this because of my work in startups, where I still talk to a lot of founders and CEOs, and they say to me, like, man, when we were 10 or 20 people, we were so innovative and great because the process was we were sitting around the table and we just yelled at each other. That's the process, right? But as soon as we got to 50 and 100 people, and things just broke down. We get no output anymore. And I ask very, very specific questions. So tell me how your organization is structured. Oh, well, we got the engineering team, the design team. Okay. So basically you told me you just roll back to waterfall, right? Because no matter what within each of those teams, how agile and cool and innovative their process is, if each team has to do their work and then throw it over the wall to the next team, you're back to waterfall by definition, right? So how about flipping that matrix and doing a squad model? So the squad model, and I certainly didn't come up with this, pioneered by a lot of what Google, Amazon calls them 1 or 2 pizza teams. Spotify, if you haven't seen it, was someone that really pioneered a lot of this, and actually we followed the Spotify model. So they've written a lot about what they've done in their thing. So how about instead of taking each of these functional teams and then assembling a project, where it ends up in most of your day, you probably work with your project teams or product teams. How about just organizing around that? How about making the strong axis of the matrix your product team, and putting the cross-functional people together. So back to the Bell Labs quote earlier, product design, engineering, or whatever people you need in there, small. My teams are 3 to 5 people, no bigger than that. And what it's allowed us to do, so when I joined, we started with 1 squad, and I'm up to 6 now. And what it does is you can parallelize innovation, right? So if we need to grow, we want to do more of this, we add more squads. And while they have to keep coordination, most of the product owners keep coordination between them, they oscillate at their own pace, and they do things at their own pace. It's allowed us to start scaling innovation, right? So this is something that works really well in a larger organization. So the last one is one that I haven't quite gotten over, but I certainly wanted to talk about. And something I've actually been talking to folks at the conference about. So that culture of the organization is the biggest impediment. And I started really digging into this, like, what is it about the culture, right? So there's some things maybe about values and other stuff, but there's one thing that I kind of came to that's the biggest one. So to get people to experimentation, the hypothesis-driven, this type of model, it doesn't align very well with the performance system. So there's a famous quote, and I often attribute it to Jack Welch, I'm not 100% sure, but it is, show me how you pay and promote, and I'll show you how your organization runs, right? So very, very true type of thing. And what we found is that in startups, again, people are very purpose-driven. You don't go to a startup to make a lot of money. I mean, I think we all know at this point, yeah, you get some equity and there's hope of riches, but you might as well play the lottery, you probably have a better shot at it, right? So the truth is that you go there because of a purpose, right? There's a purpose you can get on board, and any good startup is really rally around that purpose. But when you talk to people why they go to large organizations about, well, it's got great compensation, and it's a really good place to work, and nice people, and they got great benefits and things like that. Those are really individual goals, right? Those are things that people optimize around individuals, and thus we have review systems that talk about individual things. We at Amex have where we get a company rating as far as our input, we get a business unit, and then it goes right down to the individual level. There's no concept of group goals and group rewards, right? So one of the things that I always say is we have to separate out the performance review process from the compensation process. They're somewhat linked, but you have to break those two apart, because right now when I go into my year in review, I'm doing it to see what my compensation is. Well, guess what? I don't come out with the warts and the tests that failed and all that kind of stuff. I'm incentivized to put on my suit and look best and and make myself all pretty. That's not a way to basically get people embracing a failure culture, an experimentation culture, a test and learn culture, right? So we have to break those things apart. And it's something that we're working on, but it still is a big challenge and it's still a big impediment. Because think about this, if I'm on a project team and it's a year-long project, why do these things never, even if they're like, getting toward the end, we know the sucker's gonna fail. You can never kill those projects, right? Well, why is that? Well, because when I go into my year in review, what do I have to talk about, right? My failed project, at least if I say, well, I delivered that thing. Well, it didn't do very well, but I delivered it, right? Checkbox, got in there. That's not something that, goes very well in a review process if you are trying to do experimentation and lining it up. So make sure that there's a separation of proper feedback from a review system and a compensation system based on experimentation and learning. So I don't want to forget about some of the positive things that large enterprises do. A lot of criticisms here, but there are some very positive things, and some of the reason I, throughout my career, cycled into large enterprises. And there really are three things that they do provide, and it's really genuinely a huge benefit. And the three things that startups struggle with, right? Resources, brand, and customers. So I just walked into a place that I have millions of customers I can go test with. Now, there's some challenges, as we talked about, around that. But I have customers. I have people that I can go talk to about how I can enhance something and how I can make their lives easier, better, whatever. I've got a 165-year-old brand that is well regarded, trusted. I'm shocked when we talk to our card members how much we can get away with because of our brand reputation. But I'm also bound by that brand, right? So one of the things that I still face is, you want to put this beta out to my customers? Ooh, I'm very nervous about that. What if what if it doesn't look pretty? What if it doesn't look good? What if it's not brand aligned, right? It's a big impediment. We're trying to educate on that one, but that's a really big challenge that we still face as well there. So let me just talk real quick about a few other kind of tips and tricks and things that I found that help. First of all, you've got to have executive sponsorship. I don't know if anyone saw Janice from GE, the HR lead, talk yesterday. It was a great thing. And she talked about something I've experienced firsthand in trying to implement this. So I made sure when I went in, I had exec sponsorship because I knew I was going to have a lot of hard asks and a lot of things that I was going to have to do that were very much unconventional. So I made sure I had that. But what we did was we started with one small team. That's the same thing they did at GE. Start with one team to start getting out proof points. And this is not a side project team. This is not a 20% team. It's not something people meet, kind of do occasionally. This is the team that is gold and set up to do and work this way. It's very, very important. And make sure those people are philosophically bought in and understand that, because not only are they going to face some real hurdles that they're going to have to get over, they're the ones that are going to be the champions and the catalysts to basically spread this around the organization. So you have to have people that are really philosophically bought in. Find a really challenging product or project to start the team with. So I went in and we found a product that's something that everyone said, oh, we should definitely do this. But for 3 years, it had sat dormant. Why? It was way too hard to execute on. Teams had to get together, involve so many people, very, very difficult situations. No one could align around it. So I said, let's go take that one on. Because if I'm successful on an easy project or something that's going to be there, they could probably execute on, everyone could go back and say, well, I could have done that too in my process, right? Well, I did something where I said, hey, I turned this around in 90 days. You guys could get it together in 3 years. So that was something that actually worked really to our benefit. It's a high-risk strategy, but hey, if you're confident in the process and confident in your team, you can execute against this. Give your product and process to others. So again, we take that kind of radical transparency, we bring everyone into the fold, we have big arms, we include everyone in there. As I said, I don't go into like, I'm the ideas people, I'm like, keep feeding me the ideas, I'm the execution engine, keep it coming, bring them into the process. That's worked really, really well for us. And have a foil. I actually had two. I had someone from IT who was 20-year IT guy who said, I philosophically don't believe in this, mostly because he's protected his fiefdom. And was not bought in, not sold on it. And I said, okay, fine. Well, we'll look what your track record is and what you've done, and we'll look at what our process and what we've done. And then I had another one, which was actually more interesting, which was someone that came from the tech industry and came in as a real innovator and was taking over a really major, digital asset for the company. And came in with their process, was very much not lean. It was actually much more of an agency process, right? So they put out the most amazing PowerPoints and like really represent these big ideas, and it was really, really fascinating. Got people excited. But for 3 years, they didn't deliver anything, right? But they could show up and they could have a great presentation. That worked for a while with senior leadership. So I basically said, okay, that thing that you've been talking about for a while, I'm going to go do and build and show it in a 90-day cycle. And so it was something where they challenged us and said, lean's for startups. Lean doesn't work in big companies. We said, okay, it's fine. Let's go see what we do. So those actually really, really helped as very distinct counterpoints, and it was something that was pretty important for us. And then finally, before we get to questions, just leave this up, something that we live by day in, day out. And I'm sure you've heard it before, but it's something that is very relevant, really relevant in our environment. So before I take questions, I'm just going to put these things up. These are called the product commandments. These are the guardrails I set up for the team. I give the team a lot of flexibility to organize how they want. You got to stay within these guardrails. I also use this as the basis of the class I teach. So these are kind of the things that we live by. But I'm happy to take questions.